My name is Shona Witten. I'm the National Lead for Recovery and Psychosocial Support at Australian Red Cross. Welcome to you all. We're going to have about an hour and a half or so today with Rob. Rob's going to talk about what you can expect over the next sort of 6 months or so after the floods. Rob has extensive experience in disaster recovery, so has lots to share. Before we sort of formally kind of welcome you all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all on. I'm in Brisbane today in Meanjin on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to all of the people on the lands on which you are all joining us from today. Couple of housekeeping things. We're recording this session today and it'll be available via our website in about a week or so once we get the kind of recording, all the chatty random stuff cut out and up there for you. Juliet will be staying on the line today. She's just said hi there for you to kind of moderate the questions and the chat. Rob is going to present for about a while. And if you've got questions throughout, put them in the chat and Juliet will keep an eye on those. And at the end, she'll pose some to Rob as they come through at the end. I don't think there's any other kind of housekeeping things. You, if you do wish to ask a question rather than out loud, rather than talking, Juliet, just put your hand up at the question part at the end. There's a raise hand function down the bottom and Juliet will take you off mute. You won't be able to do that yourself in this kind of setting. So other than that, I think I'll hand over to you, Rob, and Juliet and I will take our cameras off so that you can just see Rob and not us. So thanks so much for coming, Rob, and sharing with the group, and enjoy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. What I want to do is share with you some of the experience I've gathered over about 35 years of working with disaster affected communities. And I want to first acknowledge that I've come to you from Wurundjeri land, and that's the place I was in Black Saturday when the town I live in was completely surrounded by fire. Luckily, the wind changed before it went over our place. That was pretty close. I've also done a lot of work with floods in New Zealand. New Zealand's very flood prone place, but also in Queensland, New South Wales and Northern Victoria. And there's something a bit different about floods than fires, earthquakes. In fact, every disaster has its own particular character. And more than that, every disaster of a particular type has its own character. And of course, every community has its own character. So that when these factors weave together, it makes for a particular sort of event in the community, in the psychosocial space, as we say. That is, in the space in which we live our lives, the emotional space, the social space of relationships. And what I've learned is that this space is uniquely important. The disaster is defined by the physical event, but it's only a disaster because it's a physical event of sufficient expansiveness as to affect a whole community. That's what defines a disaster. It's a community event. And a community is a physical object. It's a collection of houses or farms or whatever, and people. But most of all, it's a collection of people with relationships and history and culture. Every town has its own little culture. And in a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think things of normal community life that we can normally take for granted, but which we have to stop and think about after a disaster. Because I like to say that there are three fundamental problems that people face after a disaster, apart from the physical ones. I'm not here to talk about the physical recovery. It'll be topmost in everyone's minds: cleanup, accommodation, insurance, etc. I can't really help you with that, but I can help you to understand what people go through and how that impacts on your ability to recover, but most importantly, how it impacts on what you end up with at the other end. The three important problems for people psychologically are, the first one is the trauma. The word trauma means wound, injury, damage. It's created by the awful experiences on the day of the event, life-threatening experience for many people. Life-threatening to those we love. We know that people are very traumatized by not knowing what's happened to their loved ones for hours, weeks, months. This became evident in the research after Black Saturday. Anyone who was separated from their loved ones and didn't know what had happened to them for hours or maybe longer had much poorer mental health in the long run. It's really something that needs to be taken very seriously. The trauma is not restricted to the people who were caught in the water. But the first one is trauma. I'll come back to that in a minute. Second one is loss. The most tragic loss, of course, is of loved ones or family members or community members. We really don't realize what people mean to us until they're gone, because everyday life allows us to take their existence for granted. It's such an important factor. And we often don't have a very good language to describe a particular quality of grief we feel for a neighbour or maybe someone we didn't know very well, but we were aware of them down the street or we saw them occasionally. It is a particular quality, and especially if it happens to numbers of people. Everything that happens is therefore registered in our emotional life. And loss is dealt with by grief. That's the psychological process by which we accept and adjust to a loss of something, not just people. That's the most painful and important loss, but of whatever we've lost that's important: house, property, history, culture. We had a way of doing things, it's gone out the window. And if we lose mementos and all the things we've collected in our life, it's easy to feel you'll forget your history. And it's a bit like the key task of loss, which is to go from an attachment to something out in the world that's gone to the imprint of that attachment in me, because I carry it in me. I carry my loved ones in me. I carry my history. I carry my attachment to objects and what they mean to me, how they reflect my identity. I carry that all inside. But I'm used to having it out there where I can see it and touch it and feel supported by it. When it's lost, I have to draw it in and I have to rely on this. That takes quite a long time because we keep going out there to it, keep reaching out, and it's not there. It's a very painful process, a very time-consuming and exhausting process of our emotional energies. People sometimes minimize the significance of loss of heirlooms or hobbies or, all the things that give us daily meaning. and I'll come back to that again a bit later on. The third fundamental problem took me the longest to understand. You can certainly understand trauma and loss. Trauma is felt immediately, and loss comes up, I'd say, around about now when things have settled a little bit. A few weeks later, people are starting to think about what they haven't got anymore. And these reactions come into the foreground as we have space to think about them. I bet there's a lot of people out there who had very disturbing, threatening experiences and have had to simply put it aside and get on with what you had to do to re-establish your life, find accommodation or not find it, and try and cope with the consequences. And you don't have the capacity to stop and grieve, so you put it aside. That's a really important problem with a disaster, because the whole community's disrupted. If there's a tragedy and all your friends and relatives and neighbours are in a stable situation and got their houses and everything, they can gather around you and support you and give you space and bring you meals and give you a shoulder to cry on, and you can actually create the space where you can begin to grieve. It's hard enough as it is, but when the whole community is in the same state, it's very complicated. And that leads us to the third one, which is the element of, I'll just call it disruption. Disruption to the routines, patterns, and the ordered fabric of our lives. This is something that we take for granted in normal life, something that we assume will be the essence of our lives, that stability and doing things. Routines are based on our physical circumstances, aren't they? Where we live and what we've got and where we go every day and so on. But all that's upturned. And the problem is that if we're not careful, that element of disruption will remain in place until such time as we're in our house again, or our new house, or we've settled. And unfortunately, our experience is that for many people, not everyone, but for many people, that's going to be several years before that's fully sorted out. And I think it's very important not to fudge that. It might be depressing for me to say that. Several years, between, let's say, 1 and 3 years for most people. Some people may be able to move back into their house quite quickly. But we know from experience that there are all sorts of unexpected difficulties, availability of tradesmen and so on. And so it's this element of disruption that leads us back to what I talked about before in the beginning, which was the assumptions that we build from the fabric of everyday life in our normal community before a disaster happens. We build up those routines and expectations on the basis of repeated experiences of things being the same. And we do our very best every day to routinize things. We try to develop a routine to go to work, to put our pajamas in the right place every time, keep our cups and saucers in the right place. So we can get up in the morning and get dressed and have a cup of tea and have a breakfast, get in the car, drive to work. We don't have to think about it. It's just a routine. So what are we doing? All of that time, our mind is thinking about what we have to do today, or reflecting on and processing what happened yesterday, and making long-term plans and thinking about what I'll have for dinner and so on. This is what I call mulling time. We have opportunities to mull, turn over, digest, process, perspectivize. You know, this gives us a sense of I'm in my life and my life is ordered and it's planned, not necessarily in a piece of paper, but it's planned in my mind. I know what we're going to have for dinner. I know what we're going to do on the weekend, and so on. We have a sense of being oriented. Now, you don't need much to lose the mulling time. You just need a lot of trivia. I remember a woman after Black Saturday saying the thing she loved most of all was to get home and cook her family their meal. She loved cooking. It was the thing she enjoyed above anything. It was her hobby. It wasn't a chore, it was a hobby. She thought about it and so on. She said, after Black Saturday, it's become a nightmare because I've lived in a whole lot of different people's houses and I have to hunt around and find everything. And I keep thinking, why would you keep your saucepans in such a stupid place as that? And so on. And everything is a battle. Now, you don't do any mulling when you're dealing with that. You don't do any mulling when you're living out of a suitcase and you're rummaging through trying to find your socks, and so on. So those trivial problems to be solved when our life is disordered close in on us and take away this mulling time, this opportunity to just reflect and feel, I'm in my life. What happens instead is we run from one thing to another. What also gets lost are the taken for granted assumptions we have about the world. Everybody will have lost the assumptions they have about rain. We don't have any in Victoria, so we don't have to worry about that. But up there, rain will mean something different. I remember giving a talk to a small community out in the Grampians late one night in a little galvanised iron roofed sports pavilion, the local oval. There'd been a very nasty flash flood. It was just a couple of years after the tsunami. And people were very disturbed by this flash flood. They've not been used to it at all. And I remember as I gave this talk and I was talking about these sort of things, I noticed a woman sitting several rows back and she just had tears running down her cheeks as I was talking. And I thought, goodness me, I must be speaking rather tactlessly. I'm really upsetting this lady. And so it was a smallish group, so I just interrupted and said, excuse me, have I said something to upset you? And she just said, no, it's just the rain on the roof. It happens every time it rains. I just cry. And I hadn't noticed it, but it was raining gently on the roof. This was, probably a few months after the flood. And she said, all right, go on. And I talked to her afterwards and she told me her story. She was living for 20 years in a little valley in the Grampians, had never had a flash flood. On this occasion, she went to her back door and she looked up the valley and she saw, this is what she described, a wall of water halfway up the gum trees pouring down the valley. And of course, there'd been the tsunami and she thought, oh my God, I'm going to die. She thought, I'm going to die. Now, she had no experience of how water flows at that depth down the valley and the contours, because this never happened in her lifetime. So she imagined it's going to hit her house the same depth. As it happened, the contours were such that the water spread out and finally just lapped up against her back doorstep and there was no damage. But this illustrates a really important point, that the vision of that water coming down ruptured an assumption that she didn't realize she had about the behavior of water in her little environment. And now whenever it rained, she went back to that experience and she was back in it and she felt distressed. And that's why she was crying. Rain means flood, means death. It's sort of, then we know that gets hardwired, and it's very, very important that people are able to speak about these experiences and get them into perspective, because what she was actually focused on was the impending wall of water coming down. And she wasn't thinking. I had to ask her, where did the water end up going? And then she could retrieve the memory that said, oh, it only came up against the back step. You could, if you wanted to, go right back and say, how much deeper would the water need to be to actually flood your house? It would have had to be twice as high or something like that. And this is a really important point about trauma, that we evaluate things in the framework of our familiar experiences. When it's something that doesn't fit into that framework and ruptures those experiences, we actually then get ready for the worst possible thing. And if we end up, floating around in a very dangerous flood and having to sit on the roof and rescued by helicopter, and we are aware that other people lost their lives, that validates it all. Yes, it is exactly that dangerous. And that means people have got a very important job to do to gradually restore those expectations and assumptions. And this is what I've learned in working with people with all sorts of traumas over many years. Those assumptions that we form create a definition of our world for us. They tell us what it's going to be like. And it enables us to predict things and to interpret things and to know when things are dangerous and when they aren't. And as soon as we lose those assumptions, we realize something's happened that just completely blows them out of the water. Sorry, that's not a very tactful metaphor, is it? So it destroys those constancies, those assumptions. We don't know how to evaluate things, so we keep going back to the danger model. So we can put it like this in the psychology, that assumptions and expectations bind anxiety and give security and give stability and confidence. As soon as those assumptions are broken, even if we didn't have a life-threatening experience, as soon as they're broken, we don't know what to expect. We better get ready for everything, and we'll routinely get very ready for the worst possible thing. And therefore, it's a very common experience that people like this lady get a constant reawakening of anxiety because their assumptions have been damaged. Now, how do we restore the assumptions the way they were formed? By the repeated experiences of things being the same. Now, we're in a bit of trouble there, aren't we? Because we've got this thing called climate change. We have no idea what to expect of next year. In Victoria, we've had a couple of easy years, easy summers. But after Black Saturday, I can tell you, I don't enjoy summers. I'm on tenterhooks the whole time. I'm relaxed the last couple of years, but that's telling me that probably that won't continue. The next ones will be hot, so I'm having to adjust my expectations of summer. And I've got to build new ones, don't I? That really fully take into account, in my case, the threat of fire. And I can't imagine what it's like for you people in Lithgow. How will you ever feel safe there again? 2 floods in a month. And so if you say that the restoration of assumptions is what gradually heals trauma and allows you to feel, I'm over it, then, sorry, Lismore, thank you. I haven't been there yet, so their names. But if you say the restoration of those assumptions is the remedy to trauma, they've got to be assumptions that incorporate the trauma, but without actually losing normality. That's going to take time. So the only way you can build those new assumptions is by repeated experiences of things being the same. That means you've got to live through a few more seasons, a few more years to re-establish your sense that hopefully we don't get fires and floods like this every year. And therefore, we need to understand that the psychological recovery must take a few years to establish this deep layer of assumptions that frame our expectations and give us a sense of security. What we know is that when we have anything like a threatening or traumatic experience, we have this process which we call psychological arousal, the adrenaline response, the emergency response. Our brains are fired up with adrenaline. I don't need to really describe it to you, I'm sure. That enhances our ability to survive because it changes the way we process information and experience things. It gives us a tunnel vision onto the threat. We forget everything else, just focus on the threat, because that will enhance our survival. But if we take this lady who months later, every time it rains, she's going to go back into that state. She's going to lose the context. She's going to lose her survival. And that her house must be in a pretty good place. It's going to need a much bigger flood than that. And that was a very unusual one. Now, she's not processing all that. She's just remembering the danger. And that's the problem with trauma. And anything we can do to put those traumatic fragments into a narrative story that puts the whole experience together and takes us through from the moment of danger when we didn't know what was going to happen and we felt frightened and so on, right through to the rescue. However the rescue happened, we could have a debate about whether it should have been the government or whether it was your neighbours in their tinny. The fact is the rescue happened and the community, one way or another, took care of itself. This is a really important thing to understand and a very great strength of communities. They take care of themselves, take care of each other. And it's that narrative of the whole that takes us back to safety that can build this new form of security, which is, what have I learned from this event? What will I do next time? How will I be more prepared? And I said to this woman, you need to be a meteorologist. I remember there was a decaying cyclone coming down from Western Australia and a decaying cyclone coming down from Queensland. And they actually happened to coincide over central Victoria and just dumped all the residual rain into central Victoria. Very unusual event. I said, you need to be able to look and see that that's not going to be happening every day. And the rain we're getting now is because of just an ordinary low pressure coming across from Western Australia, and it'll drop a bit of rain and pass on and so on. So we have to think, because in adrenaline, you don't think. You just perceive and react. It's emotion and action, emotion and action, emotion and action. And therefore, what we know is one of the most valuable things is if the community can get together and talk to each other, tell their stories to each other and share it. This is where we start to process things. Now, people will say, oh, I'm too busy, or I can't go to meetings because I've got all this stuff to do. Don't you realize I've lost my house? Actually, if you don't get the chance to tell a story, you're not going to get your experience into perspective. And it's going to be very hard to re-establish your mulling time. You're going to need to do some important mulling when you're planning what to do, rebuild or redevelop your house, repair it, and so on and so forth, or do something else. And how do we think about what stuff do we buy? And you know, it's all very complicated stuff. We need our wits about us. And when you're in that adrenaline mode, your wits are only concerned about one thing: survive in the next 5 minutes, and the next 5 minutes, and the next 5 minutes, and the next. So it's this narrow tunnel vision into the present moment and the immediate circumstances, and the rest is locked out. If it's not a threat to survival, I'm not thinking about it. When you lose that context, you can't make good judgments. We make judgments in a context. We make decisions in a context, taking things into account. And if we stay in that state, we might end up being unable to cope with some things. We know that, for instance, when your brain has got the adrenaline going, you tend to be on the right-hand side of your brain, because that's the part of our brain that we think in pictures. And that's what we need to do when we're trying to survive a flood. You just are programmed to deal with a physical threat here and now. And if there isn't a physical threat here and now, you're not in the right state. You've got to fill out forms and discuss budgets and make applications. You've got to get in the left side of your brain where your language is. And therefore, it's so important to recognize you're stuck in that right side of the brain. You need to actually get into this, the left side, so you can think strategically, make creative decisions. And it'll take time to do that, but around about now, so say 6 to 8 weeks down the track, should be a time when people are starting, hopefully, to settle a little and take a breather. I'd say, you know, you probably are under, as long as you're under threat, you're in adrenaline mode in one way or another. You're probably in and out of it, of course, during the day, but it's cranking up. And it becomes a really important thing to recognize and manage. And you know you're in adrenaline mode when someone's talking to you and it's too long and too complicated, and you can see their mouth working, but you can't understand what they're saying. Or you look at a form and you can't work out, you know it's written in English, but you can't work out what it means. And it becomes too hard. I just can't deal with that today. I really should do it, but I just can't do it today. So this is a really important factor. Now, part of the situation will be provoked by the threat, the adrenaline threat of trauma, but there are a number of factors that lead to increased arousal without threat. You know, you might not have been directly in the flood, and we know that many people will feel themselves to be profoundly affected by a disaster who weren't necessarily flooded with water in their house. But we have all such complex and intricate relationships with each other in a community that the fact that this has happened in the community has all sorts of indirect consequences for me in my life. Not the least of which is I just feel so sad for what's happened to my neighbours. I feel so guilty that it hasn't happened to me. I really can't bear to look at their houses. I remember a woman in a little town called Matata in New Zealand, which was very badly flooded. And houses basically swept out to sea. And a beautiful little town. And there was one woman whose house was just a little bit higher and didn't get flooded. She said, I can't bear to drive through town. It makes me so sad, and I feel so awful for myself, for, you know, the fact that we weren't affected. And I have to go the long way around to the shops, which was about a 3/4 hour drive right out into the country and back to the other end of town to the shops, because she couldn't bear to drive through. So sort of a measure of what effort she went to protect herself from these painful feelings. And there's a second feature of this adrenaline state that actually can cause problems. And we see this routinely. It produces tunnel vision onto what's of concern to me. My ability to actually recognize someone else has got a slightly different problem is very limited. I'm focused on my issue. That's the important thing for me. Isn't it absolutely obvious this is the most important thing to deal with? And when somebody else complains about something else, there's a tendency to say, well, that's all very well for you, but I've got this problem. And they say, well, that's all very well for you, but I've got this problem. So round about now, as people start to settle and actually take stock, everyone's got their own pain and their own problems. But there's a sort of an intuitive tendency to organize the problems in a rank order. The person who lost the most, maybe including bereavements, they're the ones we feel really sorry for. They become the benchmark. And either we'll say of other people, well, you only lost stuff in your garage. What are you complaining about? And yet a loss is a loss. I remember talking to another little community in a flood-affected community in Victoria years ago. I remember we were in the local racing club. It was the best venue. And I was giving this talk about these sort of things, and again, there was a few rows of people. And I noticed a woman sitting halfway back who was really focused and looked very, very sad. And when there was a moment for questions, she said, excuse me, is it right that people who weren't flooded might also be affected? And I said, yes. And I told her, you know, what the research showed. There was research after Hurricane Katrina that interviewed 3,000 people in New Orleans and color-coded them according to how profoundly their lives had been disrupted by this event. And they were then mapped on a map of New Orleans, which was then color shaded according to the depth of water. And the researcher came out to Australia and gave a presentation that I was at. This was more or less the first slide he showed. And his question to the audience was, what's the relationship between the depth of water and the degree of impact that people felt? And everyone looked and looked and looked. Finally, someone said, there's no relation. That's right, there was no relation. There's no direct correlation. Some people whose houses were flooded to the rafters felt they weren't that badly affected. Maybe they were well insured and, you know, easily had lots of help and so on. And there are other people who had very little flood and yet they felt their lives profoundly affected. And it's a very important thing for us to remember. In our adrenaline state, we will tag things according to the physical impact, and that'll be all we're interested in. And this woman looked very sad and she asked this question, and I gave her this, you know, this explanation. And she said, oh, thank you very much. I said, were you affected? She said, oh, not really, but our shed was flooded. Now, I saw the woman behind her roll her eyes. Oh, you poor thing, your shed was flooded, eh? Now you can just imagine, if you've lost everything you own, it's a bit hard to worry about somebody's shed. But because the woman looked so sad, I just said to her, standing there in the hall, I said, what do you keep in your shed? She said, we've got all the effects from my mother's estate. She died a couple of weeks before the flood. You know, and you could just hear that all of this stuff's been put in the shed, hasn't been sorted. All of the history going back to her childhood and the family history, who knows what heirlooms were there, it's all gone. She's lost something she can't replace, hasn't she? It's an irreversible loss. If you had lovely furniture that was well insured, then your insurance pays out, you can replace it all. It's a big disruption, but a few years later, you'll have a house full of lovely furniture and you weren't that attached to the first lot anyway, you just bought it because you thought it was nice. Whereas she's lost history, identity, very personal stuff that can't be replaced. It's no good giving her a shed load of furniture she doesn't want it. And so this illustrates the complexity of things. Everybody is entitled to their own loss. And it's important that we understand that adrenaline has a second feature besides this tunnel vision, and that is it makes us egocentric. Because if I'm egocentric, I'm going to look after myself and I'll survive a life-threatening experience. We're not totally egocentric because we help each other in the community, but we help everyone in this very intense state. And afterwards, it's a focus on our own experience that helps us to survive and mobilizes the energy we need. But can you see that this narrowing of attention and this reversion to a more self-centered way of doing things is inevitably going to create tensions if people don't understand what's happening? Because when you're in adrenaline, you're in it and you don't have a chance to look at yourself from outside. You feel impatient and intolerant. You want to do things now. You get angry with all sorts of government and other people that aren't doing things the way you need them to be done. This is an absolutely inevitable part of every disaster I've ever had anything to do with. Governments will never be good enough at getting it right well enough to cater for everyone's needs, particularly if they're infrequent and they're unpredictable and so on. We might get better at it if we have more of them. But it's this tension between my need and what's available, because in the pre-disaster community, when we're living in our routine, we don't realise that our needs are being met largely. Public transport and, you know, shopping centres and power and water and all these things, we don't worry about them. We're worried about who won the football. And suddenly all of this stuff is thrust in our face. So this state of adrenaline is colossal demand on your emotions. It's a tension with the community, and we'll often see there's an initial cohesion when everybody's in the same state and all involved in search and rescue and helping people find accommodation and so on. But as time gets by, these differences start to open up. And if we don't keep a communal perspective, then they'll become competitive. And there's often a lot of argument about who was entitled to what. And in this state of adrenaline, we don't stop and ask, well, why is that? What were the criteria for that? Or I wonder if this person who's telling me that somebody got something that they didn't deserve has actually got accurate information, or is it a rumor? We don't think of anything like that. We respond to the emotion. We're programmed to respond to the emotion. Oh my God, did they? That's outrageous. They don't deserve that. I need it more, and so on. This environment is rife for rumours and myths, which charge up emotions. And this tends to polarize groups of people, differently affected people, people who were there and people who weren't, people who are insured and people who weren't. All sorts of differences start to heat up. And then you see the community start to split along these lines of the different involvements people had. It's absolutely predictable. It happens every time because it's an inevitable consequence in the social system of people being in high adrenaline mode. And that touches on a very important thing that I wanted to go back to, which was talking together about your stories. We know that there are always a lot of people who experience trauma who don't actually book sessions with psychologists. Not everyone needs to see a psychologist, a trained person. Many people process their traumas if they have opportunities to talk about them. We know that social support, which really translates as people of goodwill and understanding to talk to, that's what social support is. I talk to someone who gets it and I don't feel alone. But in the process, as I talk, I actually sort of lost stuff out. And people say things to me and gradually it gels, solves the trauma problem. And the importance of that is that to have these community events, the community needs to be together. The more it splits, the more acrimony and anger and so on that comes, the more I don't want to go and meet with people. Somebody might say something to me, or I'll feel things are different. And it becomes very painful. And those, I call them cleavages, cleavage planes, you know, diamonds, they have a very strong, but if you hit it the right place, there's a cleavage plane and it'll split. You can cut a diamond that way if you know where the cleavage planes are. Communities have cleavage planes. Normally they're all covered over with different connections, but in the disaster, it all reorganizes around this one dimension of the disaster experience, put everyone in adrenaline mode, and it becomes brittle and starts to split around about now. And it also becomes split because if you take that high adrenaline mode, everyone's going to be in high adrenaline mode. All the workers, politicians even, local government workers, everyone's in high adrenaline because it's such a huge thing. It goes back to, there are three factors that will keep us in arousal, even when the threat is gone. First one is novelty. This is a completely new situation. I've got no past experience to draw on. I have to improvise. The second one is uncertainty. I can't really define exactly what's happening and what's going to happen next. So I'm actually going to be on tenterhooks, watching what's happening, where do I work it out. The third one is conflict, not the sort of conflict I'm talking about, arguments between people. That will certainly create arousal. The conflict I'm talking about is I've got a very important decision to make, but I don't have enough information to know which is the right choice to make. I've got to go A or B. Do I stay and rebuild and fix up my house, or do I move? Do I take out a loan for my farm and risk having too much debt, or do I try and do it myself? If I get it wrong, I might lose my farm because I won't be able to survive. These are very arousing situations, and I call them the generic arousers: novelty, uncertainty, and conflict. And this keeps the arousal up still as this goes through this next few months. There's going to be a lot of arousing factors. And it therefore says one of the most important recovery strategies is hold the community together. Try and depersonalize the emotional exchanges. Yes, everyone's on adrenaline. We're all a little bit obnoxious. We're all a bit short-tempered. We're all a bit self-centered. We're all like that. And let's just keep meeting and talking and meeting together and getting people to give us information and having sausages together and joking and laughing and cooperating. And he's not so bad after all, even though he is well insured and I'm not, and he's helping me out and I'm helping, these sort of things. In the little town of Strathewen, which was very badly affected by Black Saturday, within a couple of weeks, they started, everyone in the town or in the little settlement area that was there would get together on Thursday nights and eat together. They bring a plate. And as soon as the council got organised, they said, what do you need? And they said, we need a place to meet. So they put a prefab in there straight away. And they met there every Thursday for years. And people talked. Somewhere in the second year, I was talking to one of the community leaders at one of those meetings. I used to go there every now and again and give a talk on particular stages of recovery. And he said, it's very interesting what we've been doing with these meetings, because there was a community member who went and lived in Queensland after the fires with family. She lost everything, so she just upped and went to live with her family in Queensland. And she didn't come back until the anniversary, the first anniversary. And I was looking at her when she came along to the Thursday night after the anniversary. And I was thinking, gee, she's odd. She's very strange. I don't remember her being like this. As I watched her, the way she was behaving, speaking in a loud voice and so on, I suddenly realized, hang on, we were all like that after the fire. We were all a bit crazy, all a bit eccentric and odd. But hang on, we've all moved on and she hasn't. And that's when I realized, he said, what we've been able to do together. That as a community, we've moved slowly on, and she's been left behind because she hasn't had anyone who gets it. This shows us how crucial it is to take care of our community, not just ourselves, but our community. It'll nourish us. I want to say a couple of words about grief and disruption. Grief takes a lot of energy, but it's very important to have support to do it. And we know that, psychologically speaking, perhaps contrary to everyday experience, the problem is unexpressed emotion, not expressed emotion. Expressed emotion creates releases of tension and energy. To have a good cry, everyone must have felt the relief you feel after a good cry. Because when you express emotion, you create physical changes in your body that adjust and change things. We now know a lot more about what that's doing in our brains, allowing us to see things differently, to adopt a different point of view, to release that arousal, start to use the wiser, more creative parts of our brain rather than just that instinctive part. And if we suppress the emotion, and in our culture, we've got a long tradition of stiff upper lip and so on, it's not healthy. Makes it very hard to move on. And so we need to have a tolerance and an understanding. And I'd say to people, if when you're talking to them, they start to cry, just be calm. It wouldn't be a bad thing to carry one of those little packets of tissues and just offer them a tissue and just ask them to keep telling you. Because usually people don't cry that long. We don't reassure them. We just stay with interest in what they're telling us. Because the reassurance will be saying, I don't want to listen to this. It'll be all right. Don't worry about it. But if I say, what do you miss most about that person? Or what is it that you really miss about your house? And they start to tell you something and they draw up the experience. They start to think about it. Don't necessarily talk about their feelings, talk about their thoughts, their understandings. That tends to be more stable and helps people get back to thinking. And then you, towards the end of the conversation, can say, what are you going to do? And will you be able to get another one of those? Or, what are you planning? And if they say, I don't know, I'm too upset, well, it's important you take your time, it's plenty of time, etc., etc. And just show that you're able to just listen to it. You don't have to be responsible for it. You just need to share it and be in that place with them. When we reassure people, it's like someone sitting in the corner really upset. And we go over to them and they say, I'm really upset. I can't move from this corner of unhappiness. And if you reassure them, say, look, come over on this corner. It's much, much easier. There's a chair. You can sit down and be more comfortable. But they can't move. And so we go over and sit in the chair and say, come over here. They feel they've been lost, left, abandoned. If you can bear to just sit there with them, what you'll find is that if you keep them company where they are, that's when they'll start to move. They'll say, thank you very much. Actually, it's been very good to talk. And so again, we need these opportunities to talk in the community, and it will take time to realize everything we've lost. You only fully realize things you've lost when you move into your new house or move into your repaired house. You start to stop and think about things that you used to have that aren't there, the memories associated with them. So again, this is a process that unfolds over some time. And with this disruption element, there's a really big risk that we reorganize our lives around the adrenaline priorities, which are, we've got to fix things up quickly. And damn it, we can't fix them up because everyone's so incompetent and slow that they're driving us crazy. And so we're arguing with everyone, including the people at home, because they get in the way, and I'm already agitated and upset, So what you see is in this disrupted state, there isn't this order, this management of emotions. We've got all sorts of emotions surging around. And then we get very tired. Because what adrenaline does is it shuts down the feedback systems that would tell us we're tired, frightened, in pain, or whatever. I remember the story of a woman whose father was badly burnt in Black Saturday. And if anyone knows Victoria, she had to walk him over the Black Spur down to Healesville. That's a long way through burning forest. And she's helping her poor old dad over this high pass through the mountains and down into Healesville, little town. And it was only when she'd got him into medical care that somebody said, your back is burnt. And her whole back had been badly burnt. She didn't feel it until she'd got her dad safe. And then, by gee, did she feel it. And I talked to an elderly woman in the Lockyer Valley, a small woman, had one of these great big country husbands that they sometimes have in Queensland. Great big man, about 6'6". And she said, my husband and I, she told me this story after I talked about adrenaline in this little Lockyer Valley community. And she said, my husband and I were, as the flood was coming, we didn't realize how deep it was going to be. So we went under the house and were starting to sort things out. And suddenly this tidal wave hit us and knocked us off our feet. And she said, at the time I had a broken wrist. It was in plaster. And the fridge fell over, and I had never thought about it, but fridges float as long as they remain closed. So the only thing they had to grab onto was the fridge. Now, fridges are not easy to grab onto. She said, we both grabbed onto the fridge, and then the fridge sort of rotated. My husband fell off. You know, they were elderly. He must have been in their 70s or so. And as he was floating away, all I could do was lean out with my broken wrist hand and grab hold of him. And I pulled him back and pulled him up onto the fridge. And we floundered around and eventually managed to get to the side of the water and get out. He said, afterwards, I found out I'd broken my wrist again. And this is what adrenaline will do. It will make us do what needs to be done regardless of the cost. But if you translate that heroic saving of her husband into this period now where we're running on adrenaline, we'll do ourselves damage. And one of the important things is to really ensure that people recognize this and start as soon as possible, as soon as you can, start to slow down. It's not a 200 meters hurdles, it's a marathon. You just need to start at a pace that is regular and then hold on to the things that give you energy, meaning, value, your relationships, the things you enjoy, opportunities for mulling, time out. I've got so much to do, I haven't got any time out. No, you must take off Sundays. I'm not going to do any recovery on Sunday. I'm going to sit in the sun or talk to people or just relax, because absolutely crucial stuff is going to be going on in your brain that will enable you to make much better decisions. Because if you don't do this, even the best will in the world, around about 6 months, people are going to get so tired because adrenaline will burn up all your energy, much of it in things like anger and conflict and so on, and rushing around doing things inefficiently that end up having to be redone without great benefit. It would have been much better to try and do half as much in twice the time. And then you would retain an absolutely crucial asset, and that's your quality of life. Because what I see happening time and again is that in the period as we come out of this adrenaline state, this urgent emergency condition, it's very hard for people to have the presence of mind to stop, slow down, build routines in whatever their situation is now, prioritize relaxation and leisure and creativity and so on, social contact. If they don't prioritize that, they end up with not a mental illness. There will be some people who have anxiety states and depression, they need help, but all of us will be vulnerable to what I call degraded quality of life. That's not a mental illness. It just means things don't feel good. I don't feel right. It doesn't make sense. I'm so tired, I hardly care. I haven't got time or energy for my partner. My kids just irritate me. I don't have the energy, you know, and so on. And that sets up a really important problem. That is the problems that happen from 6 months on through the end of the first year into the second year, into the third year, however long it takes. When if you've got a degraded quality of life, the relationships break down, or they might not break down. I remember one woman telling me 7 years after Ash Wednesday, 1983, 7 years later, that's 1990, I was giving a talk, what I understood then. This woman came up to me and said, I recognize what's happened to my family now for the first time. She says, my husband and I are still together, but we're just good friends. I don't see my teenage daughter. She was 14 at the time. She's now 21. She's gone off to uni. She hardly ever comes home. The one I feel really sad about is my 7-year-old son at the time. He's now 14. He was a happy, outgoing kid, achieving well at school, lots of friends, interest in everything. Now he's a lonely, isolated boy who sits inside and watches TV. There'll be computer games now. There's no friends, failing at school. See, this woman's family has been gutted. not by trauma, not by loss, but by degraded quality of life, because they didn't have the opportunity to rebuild their family life and be together and value each other. Because when we come out the other end of recovery, what's important is that we have a life that we enjoy, that's full of value, and that we've learned absolutely irreplaceable lessons from this huge and unwanted experience. And if we can do that, we'll grow. We didn't want it, and we've never be quite as financially well off, but we will grow as people. But we'll need to do it in a community together. And we'll need to make decisions that value the quality of life, because I call this period from about 6 months on is the time when people are vulnerable to the second disaster. The first disaster is terrible, but the losses are largely reversible. Most people will get a house of some sort sorted out eventually. They'll get full of furniture and so on. There are some, of course, if people have lost loved ones, and I've talked about some of the other irreversible losses. But many of the losses that are so disturbing to us are eventually reversible. But if a marriage loses its heart, or if the kids no longer want to have contact with us, or we've lost interest in our career, or we don't feel happy about our community, it's much, much harder to reverse them. So therefore, my message is understand this state and manage it. And there are lots of things we can do to manage our adrenaline state. Slow down. Do it slowly while you hang on to the most important things of your life, which are not your house, which are your relationships and your emotional welfare and all of those other things. Look, I'll leave it there and see if anyone's got any questions or any thoughts, or maybe you've got some stories for me.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rob, for your reflections and insights. That was really wonderful. We have had several comments and questions come through, so I'll start with those. But if anyone else has any questions, please send them through the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll unmute your microphone for you to ask yourself. So a comment here from Ruth. I'll read this out if that's okay, Dr. Rob.
Yeah.
I think the narrative needs to include the understanding that extreme events are going to increase in magnitude and frequency. These are the new assumptions. The new narrative is how the community recovers and builds in new ways within such difficult times, and what we knew previously falls away, new ways arise.
Yeah. That's right, because the answer to trauma is not to go back to the life you had before, because it's irreversibly changed. Something that never happened to you before has happened. We have to build new assumptions, but new assumptions that put the trauma into the right place. Otherwise, the trauma becomes the center, and we reorganize ourselves around that. I work with people who've got serious long-term post-traumatic stress, and their lives, if we're not careful, tend to be lived waiting for the trauma to happen again, but it doesn't happen. Something else happens maybe. The person that's been involved in a criminal event is waiting for that, but the biggest risk to them for the next 25 years is a car accident, but they're not worried about the car accident any more than you or I are. A person who's had a bad car accident and nearly become quadriplegic, these are people I've worked with, is not in the slightest worried about being involved in a criminal event. She's terrified of a certain intersection on the road and so on. So the answer to these people is to rebuild the assumption to say, yes, car accidents happen. Yes, criminal events happen, but they're infrequent. And there's a whole lot of things I can do to take care of myself. And that means I've got to really start processing. We know that the sooner we start to process the trauma, the easier it is. We can do that very well with each other. Well, we do a pretty good job with each other. And if it's not moving, that's when it's really important to see someone with training, because there'll be a reason, there'll be something you've not really taken account of. And like this, I mentioned this tunnel vision, the stuff out here that you're ignoring. You need someone with training to sort of get that into the loop. Climate change means we're all in this state, aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. Our next comment, it's tricky as what we are hearing from some in Queensland is that they are losing their sense of community as neighbours and friends are being forced to relocate, further impacting the loss grief element that you mentioned earlier.
That's right. There will be a grief in losing your community. Look, there are things you can do about that. In Ash Wednesday already, there was a very concerted effort to make sure that everybody who belonged to the communities was registered. And they sent out regular newsletters. We do it all by email now. And made sure that everyone was informed about everything. When they developed recovery committees, people were told about it and given the opportunity to participate in decision making in whatever way we can do that now with Zoom and email. We can do these things a lot easier. So I think it's a really important thing to reach out. Some will come back, some won't. But that contact will be so important for everyone. And it's part of the assumptions that we don't realise, unless we're people with a particularly strong profile, we don't realise that we're important. We're all important. The community consists of all of us. We need to encourage people to participate in these processes because of what they can give just by being there. I think we need to try and come to the challenge of networking. We know that in some disasters I've worked in, things like the Port Arthur shooting and the tsunami and so on, we mapped where everybody was, and we're able to develop sort of recovery hubs in the suburbs where there are in the closest suburb to where a number of people were, or if people move away to particular areas, we can try and build recovery linkages to maybe the local governments in those areas and ask them to help out. So there are lots of initiatives we can take once we hold this this recognition that the community is the most important recovery resource. The research of Daniel Aldridge, and we can make available reference of this American researcher that I mentioned with New Orleans. He's done huge studies in Asia and Japan. He's looked at disasters going right back to the beginning of the 20th century, the San Francisco earthquake and the Japanese earthquake, and so on, and all of the tsunami events, the Fukushima tsunami events. And he's compared all of the communities and local governments and prefectures and their recovery, and done all sorts of statistics. And what he's been able to show is the one factor that best predicts the speed and the completeness of the recovery. That is the number of people who return, how quickly they get going, and the quality of their life afterwards. It's not how much money was spent on them and how good their connection with politicians was. It's the single measure of what he calls social capital. Social capital is basically the relationships you have that then give you access to helping networks and information networks and so on. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about community meetings of all sorts. And we need to understand that that's the most important thing that will see you right through. And like Strathewen, they still meet now once a month, and now in the new community centre that was rebuilt around their oval, but they still meet there once a month. Not everyone goes every time, but there's a sense of community there that is really special. Wasn't there before. They did have a sense of community, but this is a very special sense of togetherness. And this is how we grow.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here from Beth, who says, hi, I'd be interested to hear more about how we can contribute to the well-being of children post-disaster. And thank you so much for offering this to our community.
Look, it's such an important topic, Beth. Thank you. We could give a presentation on the different age groups even for each one. Maybe we'll give some time to that as we go through with these different webinars. The first thing is to realise that the best predictor of the emotional state of the children is the emotional state of the parents. The best thing you can do for them is to look after yourself and get out of high arousal, get out of adrenaline mode. Because in adrenaline mode, you won't notice what's happening with the kids unless it really gets in the way. And when I was working in Christchurch, I went there about 8 or 9 times after the earthquake. This issue came up, and one day I remember thinking to myself, what's the one thing we can say to parents? And what came to me was, just give your children your absolute undivided attention as regularly as you can, which means just hang out with them. Don't do anything with them, just be with them. Have a bit of fun, just hang out. And if you give them your attention, you can ask them how you're going. Kids often don't know what to say. If you just be with them, often conversation will flow. If the little kids are playing on the floor, just sit there with a cup of tea and watch their play and chat to them about it. And I bet you'll find they're playing some aspect of disasters. This is a really important thing for them to do, because just as adults need to talk about it, the kids don't have the language. Even teenagers don't always have the language, but they'll play it out. And maybe one thing we can do is give a little bit of a verbal commentary to their play. Oh, looks like he's in trouble. How's he going to get out of that? Oh, look, the police have come and rescued him. Isn't that great? Isn't it great that there are people there to rescue us? And so on. You can just chat with them. So that'd be the best thing I think we can say. It's another thing. Children know whatever's happening. They don't always know that they know, but they know it with their gut. So, you know, if the kids catch you crying in the bathroom because you're overwhelmed, it's best to talk about it with them. You don't need to share your emotion with them. I think we adults, it's good to be private, to have boundaries. You know, you go into the bedroom and you have a weep. It's quite kids I've seen are often well aware that their mum goes into the bedroom and has a weep and things are tough. If she comes out and wipes her eyes and says, sorry, I've been a little bit upset, but I'm feeling a lot better now. I just had to have a little lie down for a few minutes. You don't have to give them all the detail, but they know you're upset. They don't know if they should come in. I just need a little bit of time to myself. Now I'm feeling much better. How are you going? Shall we go for a walk? And you can just do something. And it actually creates a sort of boundary around the distress by defining it. And similarly, if you're stressed and you get irritable and lose your temper and shout at them, always say sorry. Just say, look, sorry, I'm very difficult. I got a bit upset. I shouted at you. I don't like doing that. And don't then say, but if you wouldn't do that again, I wouldn't have to shout at you. Don't do that. Just say, I'm sorry. Let's just do something else. Let's have some fun. And this sort of clear message that when I'm in my clear state of mind, I love you. I'm going to take care of you. We're going to get through this. And the rest is just noise, right? We need to create this reference point. This is the real relation. This is what you can trust. I care about you. And I think the same is there with teenagers, except it's a slightly different wavelength. Teenagers will often want to spend a lot of time. One group of teenagers will spend a lot of time with their friends. They want to escape the unhappiness that's going on in the house when everyone's worried and so on. And they want to be out with their friends. Sometimes parents worry that they're spending too much time. They want them at home. And the kids sort of feel, everyone's unhappy at home. Why would I want to be at home? I want to distract myself and play computer games and ride my BMX and hopefully not get into too much trouble. my experience that when parents go up against the peer group, they usually lose. So have a look at your child, and if you were pretty confident how they were going before, trust them. If there are already a few problems, try and invite them to bring the kids home if you can, or just be interested in what they're doing. Oh yeah, who was there? What did you do? Just get involved in it a little bit by inviting them to talk. With teenagers, don't try and do too much at once. You know, get a few sentences out of them and you've done well. There's another group of kids who have trouble with peer group. Not everyone is sort of able to get out and mix with kids. And often the part of the disruption is the links they had get lost and they get anxious and they don't feel that they can go out. And I think for these kids, it's usually, and I hope this happens in your communities, some kind of drop-in centre or some kind of youth activities can be got going. This is terribly helpful for those kids. Even the kids who are part of groups often feel lonely because the group doesn't know how to talk about a lot of things. And so to have those different opportunities for kids to meet outside the family, but with hopefully trained youth workers or somebody of that sort to facilitate, allows them to do their processing in their own way. And most of all, I think, create fun at home, create fun. Have movie nights and whatever games, board games, whatever, you know, just try to have fun in whatever way will work, because that's what will, again, create the social capitalist sense that, okay, the family's still intact and we're still together and mum and dad understand and they're spending time with me. It'll be very hard when we've got all our priorities, but your kids are the most important thing. Each other and your kids are the most important thing. That should come first, and then rebuild as you can. Thanks, Beth.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here from Clayton. How can we help a region of people process coping with torrential rain when there has been 2 floods in 3 weeks in the Northern Rivers?
Yeah, you know, you're pushing me beyond my experience. And this is a part of disaster work, isn't it? We keep coming up against things we haven't had before. But look, I think one thing that would be very important is to educate people about weather and weather maps, Bureau of Meteorology, how to get information. It may be very helpful to set up for maybe for a few years, sort of, I don't know, in social media, a dedicated weather channel where you've got some maybe volunteer meteorologist or someone with a bit of training like that who can interpret. It's a major issue for interpreting technical information. In adrenaline mode, we can't make sense of it. We think we know what the words mean, but we don't really. And so someone who can translate it all, and very often when weather people have a conversation about the weather and what it means, and don't use technical language, but explain it in ordinary language. And the ordinary language I would suggest is the language that would be readily understood by you know, an intelligent, bright primary school child, because you know, developmentally primary school children aren't up to using abstract concepts and complicated ideas. They want things systematically laid out. They can understand them then. And we're all like that when we're in adrenaline. I am, you are. We're all like that because we're programmed for physical events, not for concepts. And so I think you could do a lot by setting up a dedicated opportunity to interpret and process. The second thing I would be suggesting is the communal recognition that there's going to be quite a period of time when these weather events are distressing and generating of emotions. And therefore people need to recognize, I'm upset, I'm anxious. Anxiety's the fear of what might happen. Fear is fear of something in front of me, like a snake. Anxiety is once the snake's been removed, that there might be another snake here. So I don't want to come here anymore. And the problem with anxiety is we can't do anything about it because it hasn't happened yet. And the problem is we want the idea of the threat to be taken away, but it can't be because it hasn't happened. And this leaves us feeling helpless. But one thing we can do is we can say, wait a second, I'll look at myself and I'll name my state as anxiety. And now I can set about managing anxiety. And there's a lot of information, but simply put, you can say anxiety's got two components. It's got the ideas of the threat and the danger. And secondly, it's got the arousal that triggers. It's, again, another version of adrenaline, isn't it? And we can use a lot of techniques to calm ourselves down, deep breathing and mindfulness and so on, recognizing this and managing down the anxiety. We call it down regulating constantly, making sure we have times in the day when we put aside all these worries and just relax and enjoy ourselves. And the second one is to deal with the ideas, and that means coming back to the knowledge. And also, what will I do next time? What have I learned? What would I like to have done last time, but I didn't do it, and so on. And being prepared and building networks of mutual aid in the suburb where you live or whatever are very helpful things. They give us a sense of control where we lost it. So that's a big topic.
It is, and so are some of the other questions or comments that have come through. I'm not sure we'll get a chance or have the time today to go through all of them. A couple I wanted to highlight that we will address in follow-up emails, though, is we have a question from Ian. Could you also address the recovery for emergency responders at some stage? We're carrying scars as well, not the same losses, but emotional scars nonetheless.
That's right. Everyone involved is deeply touched by it. Many of emergency responders have traumatic responses. Maybe they were in danger themselves, but they also make a very intimate connection, attachment, if you like, to the people they're helping. And I think it's most important that they have opportunities to debrief, but also just to keep talking about their experience in their own networks. And very often it's helpful for them to participate in the community recovery activities. There'll be many useful conversations that they can have with community members explaining things. It's very important for helpers to know what happens to the people that they were involved with and how they're going. But very important to process the technicalities of their work. I've certainly worked with people from emergency services that carry an enormous amount of guilt that they couldn't do more. And very often people carry a sort of an implicit responsibility for their whole community that they can't really exercise that responsibility. It's, in a disaster, it's too big. They've gone into this work with that value, and we need to help them sort of understand the limits and to value what they could do and to accept what they couldn't do. And then there's the third one of often the system doesn't work so well and doesn't know things and things aren't coordinated as well. That leaves people feeling with, again, a lot of frustration and guilt. And I think the only answer to that, apart from sort of working it through and debriefing it, is to feel that the system learns. It's very important. But again, a big topic.
It is a big topic and one that keeps coming up for us at the Red Cross. So for Ian and any other emergency workers, we are looking at running something for those workers in particular. So in our follow-up email, where we will send the link to this webinar, we'll also include any other information that we have about specific webinars or other programs that we hope to make available for emergency services specifically. Okay.
And I perhaps just make a very quick comment about Claire's, is it Claire? conspiracy theorists, misinformation. This comes back to what I said about myths and rumours. In this tremendously highly aroused process, there's a huge stimulation for everybody, but there's often not enough information to have what we have in normal life, which is a relatively coherent picture of what's going on. And so when we're in high arousal, it's very hard to take the fact there is no information. We fill it in with whatever we can find. We may put it from our own head, we may get it from the internet, and that depends where you look. The best way to hold the fact that there is no information available is to keep saying there's no information. This comes back to communication networks, dedicated communication networks for the disaster affected community that is able to identify through the communal connections what are the questions, what are the issues, and through newsletters or handouts or emails or whatever, and preferably all of the above, Facebook, to actually keep giving regular information and updates that's relevant to those questions. Remember that the conspiracy theory idea is to say that someone has control even if they have bad intentions. That's their psychological driver. It's very hard for us to accept that, because normal societies is about everything's under control. And when we lose control, it's very tempting to say, oh no, we haven't really lost control. Somebody else has got control. Somebody's got secret control. And I think one way around that is to work to restore connectedness with people, bring them together, process the information together, and accept that although we don't have control, in a few years, we will have a community that works. And if we do it well, it'll be a richer, wiser, and more valuing community than it was before.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rob. I think you've managed to capture all of the questions that were answered today. And thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar. I hope you've had the opportunity to have take away some great insights and learnings from Dr. Rob. I'd also like to mention that this webinar is part of a webinar series in disaster recovery. The next webinar is on the 26th of April, community-led recovery after disasters. If you'd like to know more about this, you can head to the Red Cross website and where you can register. We'll also send that link in the email that will come to you after this session. Thanks again for coming, and I really hope to see some of you again for the next webinar. Have a great
I wish everybody all the best with the journey you have ahead, and hopefully I'll get up there and visit you one day.